a tear that changed everything. It began on a morning so quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The forest was still. The sun filtered softly through the trees, and under the shade of an old Bodhi tree, a monk sat in silent meditation, his posture steady, his breath calm, his presence unmoving. But above him, high on a crooked branch, something trembled, a crow, alone, tired, and carrying more sorrow than any creature his size should ever have to bear. He wasn't born bitter, but life had taught him that he wasn't welcome. Wherever he went, he was chased away. His feathers were too dark, his voice too harsh, his presence unwanted. No one had ever called him beautiful. No one had ever offered him kindness. And that morning, with the weight of all those rejections pressing down on him, the crow whispered a thought he had never dared speak before. Maybe the world would be better without me in it. A tear welled in his eye. One last tear, heavy with years of sadness, and it slipped down his cheek. That single tear fell through the leaves, carried by the quiet air, and landed gently on the forehead of the monk below. The monk opened his eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't brush the tear away. He simply looked up and met the crow's eyes. There was no judgment in that gaze, only stillness, and something deeper, something the crow had never seen before, understanding. The monk spoke only 5 words, but they echoed louder than a lifetime of silence. "Why are you crying, little one?" And in that moment, the crow broke. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar warmth of being seen. That moment didn't erase his suffering, but it opened a door. A journey would follow, through envy, beauty, comparison, and longing. And in the end, something far greater than admiration or transformation would await him. But it all began with one tear, and a pair of eyes that didn't look away. The crow no one wanted. The monk's question lingered in the air like incense. Gentle, patient, impossible to ignore. "Why are you crying, little one?" The crow hesitated. He had never spoken to a human before, let alone one who didn't chase him away. He looked down from the branch, eyes filled with hesitation, sorrow, and something even more fragile, hope. "I cry because I don't belong," the crow finally said. "I'm tired of being unwanted." His voice cracked as he spoke, raw from silence and sorrow. He began to explain, not in anger, but in quiet resignation, how every day of his life felt like a reminder that he wasn't enough, that he was, somehow, wrong for simply being what he was. "I'm not beautiful," he said. "My feathers are dull, my voice is harsh, people throw stones at me. Children scream when I fly too close. Other birds stay away. No one wants a crow around." Each word was a wound, reopened, but saying it aloud felt like releasing something he'd held too long. The truth, however painful, had been locked inside him, festering in the darkness of self-loathing. He spoke of hunger, of being ignored while other birds were fed, of wishing he could trade places with someone else, anyone else, just to know what it felt like to be accepted. He confessed that sometimes he stayed quiet just so no one would notice him, blending into the shadows, hiding not just from the world, but from himself. "I see others shine," he continued. "Bright feathers, sweet songs. People smile when they come near. They don't have to try. They're just loved." Then he paused, and when he looked back down, his voice was almost a whisper. "But me, I'm only ever tolerated. If I'm lucky." The monk remained silent, but his gaze never left the crow. It was the kind of listening that few ever receive, a presence that didn't interrupt, correct, or pity, just stayed. And in that sacred silence, something remarkable happened. The crow's pain, so long wrapped in shame, began to unravel. He wasn't trying to gain sympathy. He wasn't seeking attention. He was simply telling the truth. And the truth was this: sometimes being unwanted hurts more than being hated, because hate still sees you. But being unwanted, It makes you feel invisible. The monk finally spoke, and his voice was like warm rain falling on scorched earth. You believe no one wants you, he said. But that is only a thought repeated so often, it became your truth. But thoughts are not truth. They're only passing clouds. The sky remains untouched. The crow didn't understand. Not yet, but a seed had been planted. Because sometimes, before healing begins, the heart must be heard. Not fixed, not improved, just heard. And in that moment, for the first time, the crow's heart was no longer invisible. The monk who didn't look away. The monk sat silently, listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole presence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer shallow words of comfort. He simply remained, anchored like the tree behind him, holding space for the crow's sorrow without turning away. When the crow finished speaking, there was a long pause. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that lets pain breathe. The monk looked up again, not with pity, but with calm clarity, as if he had seen this suffering before, not just in crows, but in people, in himself, in the fabric of all life. Pain, the monk finally said, is not what breaks us, it's what connects us. The crow blinked, confused. He had expected the monk to offer a solution, a way to make the pain stop, a chant, a miracle, anything to change what he felt inside. But the monk gave him none of that. Instead, he gave him something far more rare, understanding without judgment. The monk's voice was quiet, yet it seemed to reach deeper than sound. He spoke not in riddles or teachings, but in the language of presence. You believe your suffering is because you are a crow, he said. But suffering does not come from being a crow. It comes from the belief that you should be something else. That struck the crow like a wind cutting through feathers. He had spent his entire life trying to not be what he was, hating his voice, hiding his wings, shrinking himself to take up less space. He didn't want to be seen because he didn't want to be seen as himself. The monk's eyes softened. In the eyes of nature, he said, a crow is not lesser than a swan, not more than a peacock. A crow is simply a crow, but in the eyes clouded by comparison, everything becomes distorted. The crow looked away. It was hard to hear, harder still to accept. I just want to be beautiful, he murmured. The monk smiled gently, not with amusement, but with compassion. We all want to be seen as beautiful, he said. But there is a beauty deeper than appearance. The beauty of being true, of being whole, of being exactly who you are, without shame. The crow said nothing. But inside, something began to loosen. A tight knot of self-hatred that had been tangled for years started to unravel, just a little. The monk could feel the hesitation in the crow's heart. So he offered something unexpected. If it would help, he said calmly, I can recite a sacred mantra that might transform you into whatever bird you wish to become. The crow's eyes widened. You can do that. I can, the monk replied. But I will only do so on one condition. What is it? The crow asked, suddenly hopeful. Go, said the monk, and find the bird you wish to become. Ask them if they are truly happy. Then return to me. And if you still want to change, I will help you. The crow nodded quickly, almost without thinking. His heart leapt with excitement. Finally, a way out. A chance to become something more lovable, more admired, more accepted. He spread his wings and took off into the sky. But the monk remained seated beneath the tree, eyes half closed, hands resting gently in his lap. He knew what the crow would find. Because the monk had once been a seeker, too. The monk who didn't look away. Full narrative, voiceover ready. The monk sat silently, listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole presence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer shallow words of comfort. He simply remained, anchored like the tree behind him, holding space for the crow's sorrow without turning away. When the crow finished speaking, there was a long pause. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that lets pain breathe. The monk looked up again, not with pity, but with calm clarity, as if he had seen this suffering before, not just in crows, but in people, in himself, in the fabric of all life. Pain, the monk finally said, is not what breaks us, it's what connects us. The crow blinked, confused. He had expected the monk to offer a solution, a way to make the pain stop, a chant, a miracle, anything to change what he felt inside. But the monk gave him none of that. Instead, he gave him something far more rare, understanding without judgment. The monk's voice was quiet, yet it seemed to reach deeper than sound. He spoke not in riddles or teachings, but in the language of presence. You believe your suffering is because you are a crow, he said. But suffering does not come from being a crow. It comes from the belief that you should be something else. That struck the crow like a wind cutting through feathers. He had spent his entire life trying to not be what he was, hating his voice, hiding his wings, shrinking himself to take up less space. He didn't want to be seen because he didn't want to be seen as himself. The monk's eyes softened. In the eyes of nature, he said, a crow is not lesser than a swan, not more than a peacock. A crow is simply a crow, but in the eyes clouded by comparison, everything becomes distorted. The crow looked away. It was hard to hear, harder still to accept. I just want to be beautiful, he murmured. The monk smiled gently, not with amusement, but with compassion. We all want to be seen as beautiful, he said. But there is a beauty deeper than appearance. The beauty of being true, of being whole, of being exactly who you are, without shame. The crow said nothing. But inside, something began to loosen. A tight knot of self-hatred that had been tangled for years started to unravel, just a little. The monk could feel the hesitation in the crow's heart. So he offered something unexpected. If it would help, he said calmly, I can recite a sacred mantra that might transform you into whatever bird you wish to become. The crow's eyes widened. You can do that. I can, the monk replied. But I will only do so on one condition. What is it? The crow asked, suddenly hopeful. Go, said the monk, and find the bird you wish to become. Ask them if they are truly happy. Then return to me. And if you still want to change, I will help you. The crow nodded quickly, almost without thinking. His heart leapt with excitement. Finally, a way out. A chance to become something more lovable, more admired, more accepted. He spread his wings and took off into the sky. But the monk remained seated beneath the tree, eyes half closed, hands resting gently in his lap. He knew what the crow would find, because the monk had once been a seeker, too. I want to be someone else. The wind brushed gently through the leaves as the crow circled above, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with anticipation. For the first time in his life, he believed he might escape the life he had always hated. Below him, the monk's words echoed. Ask the bird you wish to become, if they are truly happy. He already knew his answer. He didn't need to ask. He wanted to be a swan. To him, swans were everything he was not: graceful, admired, loved. Their feathers shimmered in the sun. They moved with elegance. No one threw stones at a swan. No one recoiled in disgust when they flew by. People carved their shapes into wood, painted them on glass, whispered their names in poetry. Swans belonged in paintings. Crows belonged in shadows. The crow didn't hate the swan. He envied it. He longed for the freedom he believed beauty would bring. He imagined what it would feel like to be looked at with adoration instead of avoidance, to be welcomed instead of warned against. I just want to be seen differently, he whispered to the sky. I just want to be someone else. The thought carried with it a quiet desperation, not one born of vanity, but of survival. He believed that if he could shed the image of the crow, he might finally be free of the pain that came with it. But something inside him trembled. Not doubt, Not resistance. Something subtler. Something unspoken. He landed by a calm pond, where the water mirrored the sky like glass. Across the surface glided a swan, just as breathtaking as he had imagined. White feathers glowing in the morning light. Every movement fluid, silent, sacred. The crow hesitated. He had come with certainty. But now, looking at the swan up close, something inside him stirred. It wasn't admiration, it was curiosity. A quiet voice asked, "What if the beauty you see hides something you don't?" Still, he pushed the question away. This was his chance. So he stepped closer and spoke softly. "Excuse me." The swan turned. Her eyes were gentle, but distant, as though they looked past him rather than into him. "You're so beautiful," the crow said. "You move like the wind. People adore you. You must be so happy." The swan tilted her head. Her feathers glistened. She was everything he thought he wanted to be. And yet, she sighed. "Everyone sees my white feathers," she said, "but they don't see the loneliness behind them." The crow blinked. "I am admired," she continued, "but I don't feel connected. People love the image of me, but they don't know me. They don't see the longing inside, the pressure to stay perfect, the fear of fading." The words cut deeper than the crow expected. He thought becoming her would free him. But now he saw something else. A prison made not of bars, but of expectation. A life curated to be admired, but not lived. The crow remained quiet. He didn't ask to be a swan again. Not that day. He simply bowed, thanked her, and took flight once more. He had more to learn. The sadness behind the beauty. The crow flew higher, but his mind remained heavy. He had come to the swan expecting to find joy wrapped in feathers, elegance surrounded by ease. Instead, he had glimpsed something unsettling. Pain, carefully concealed beneath white perfection. It wasn't the answer he expected, and yet he couldn't deny it. The swan's sadness was real. As he soared over trees and rivers, a thought echoed louder than the wind. If even the beautiful feel unseen, then maybe beauty isn't what makes us happy. Still, a flicker of hope remained. The swan might be lonely, but she was only one example. There had to be a bird out there who was both admired and at peace. That's when he remembered the parrot. Bright, playful, adored. Parrots had color, voice, charm. They turned heads and lifted moods. People loved parrots, not from afar, but up close. They invited them into their homes, taught them words, gave them names. That, surely, must be happiness. With new determination, the crow set off in search of one. He found the parrot perched high on a fruit tree, its feathers glowing in the sun, green and gold, with hints of blue. It chirped a cheerful tune that seemed to dance in the air. Below, children laughed and pointed. The parrot whistled in return, fluttering its wings with practiced grace. The crow approached, hopeful. "You must be the happiest bird alive," he said. "Everyone loves you. You're colorful, clever, and people smile when you speak." The parrot looked down, then glanced at the children below. Its eyes, though bright, held something quieter, something weary. "People do love me," the parrot replied, "but often they love me for what I can give them, not for who I am." The crow tilted his head. "I bring joy," the parrot continued, "but I live in fear. Many of my friends are trapped in cages, bought for entertainment, kept for show. Some are taught words, but never heard. We become decorations in human homes. Beautiful, but not free." The crow's wings sagged. "I thought your voice gave you freedom," he said softly. The parrot smiled, but it was a tired smile. "It gave me attention, not freedom." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The laughter of children faded in the background, replaced by a deeper silence, the kind that sits between two creatures who understand each other, not because they've lived the same life, but because they've both been misunderstood. The crow thanked the parrot and prepared to leave. He didn't need to ask if the parrot was happy. The answer had already arrived, quietly, between the lines. As he flew away, the sky seemed wider, but not brighter. His heart carried the truth the parrot had revealed. Not every cage has bars. And sometimes, the most beautiful voices are the ones no one truly listens to. The parrot's fear of fame. The wind carried the crow higher, but his thoughts weighed heavier than ever. The swan had shown him that beauty did not guarantee connection. The parrot had revealed that admiration could come at the cost of freedom. Both had been wrapped in everything he thought he wanted, yet neither lived the happiness he imagined. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. One last image shimmered in his mind: the peacock. If any bird embodied pure admiration, it was the peacock. Crowds gathered just to look at him. His feathers weren't just colorful, they were spectacular. He wasn't simply seen, he was celebrated. If anyone was happy, it had to be the peacock. The crow followed the road that led to a place he had always avoided: the human world. There, behind gates and walls, in a space filled with voices and flashes of light, he found what he was looking for. In the corner of a zoo stood a golden enclosure, and inside it, a peacock. He moved slowly, deliberately, every step poised like a dance. His tail, a cascade of iridescent blues and greens, shimmered even under the harsh artificial light. Visitors gathered in awe. Children pointed. Cameras clicked. Compliments flew through the air like confetti. The crow watched from a branch nearby, struck by the spectacle. When the crowd dispersed, he flew down and landed near the bars. The peacock turned, graceful even, in stillness. "You're incredible," the crow said. "People come from everywhere just to see you. They adore you. You must be so proud, so happy." The peacock looked at him with calm eyes. Not cold, not dismissive, just tired. "I used to think I was happy," the peacock replied. "When I was younger, the attention felt like sunlight. I basked in it. I thought it meant I mattered." The crow stepped closer. "But then I noticed something," the peacock continued. "The more people loved how I looked, the more I was kept inside this cage. The more they admired me, the less I moved freely. They say I'm beautiful, and because of that, they take what they want." He turned slightly, revealing the subtle gaps in his feathers, places where plumes had been plucked. "They take pieces of me," he said, "to decorate their world and leave me behind bars. I can't fly. I can't choose. I can't be anything but what they want to see." The crow was silent. "I'm not ungrateful," the peacock added. "But don't confuse attention with affection or praise with peace. I shine, but I am not free." Those words landed heavy in the crow's chest. He had flown all this way, hoping to find a life worth trading for. But now, standing in front of this magnificent creature, he realized the truth was more complicated. He thought fame was freedom, that being desired meant being happy. But in the peacock's golden prison, he saw something else: a life built on performance, maintained by sacrifice. The peacock looked at him kindly. "You're lucky, crow," he said. "No one wants to put you in a cage." The crow didn't respond. He only bowed his head, and as he flew away, he didn't envy the peacock. He grieved for him. The peacock's golden prison. The golden bars shimmered in the afternoon light, catching the sun in a way that made them look almost beautiful. From a distance, they could have passed for art, ornamental, luxurious, like something that belonged in a palace. But for the one inside, they were still a prison. The crow stood silently before the enclosure, watching the peacock move with regal elegance. Each step was deliberate, each turn measured. His feathers, blue, green, violet, and gold, unfolded behind him like a painting in motion. People gathered around, their eyes wide with awe, their voices filled with admiration. Phones rose into the air. Camera shutters clicked. Compliments echoed like applause. But none of them noticed the peacock's eyes. They didn't see the fatigue hiding behind the color. They didn't hear the silence behind the fanfare. They didn't ask what it cost to be admired every single day. When the crowd finally drifted away, the crow stepped closer, hesitant but curious. "You're extraordinary," he said. "I've never seen anything so beautiful. You must be the happiest bird alive." The peacock turned his head slowly. His eyes, though calm, held the weight of something that words rarely carried: quiet suffering. "I used to believe that," he said. "I thought beauty was freedom. I thought being loved by everyone meant I would never feel alone." The crow listened closely. "I was celebrated," the peacock continued. "But over time, I became something to look at, not someone to understand. My feathers became my value. My dance became my performance. And this cage became my home." He paused, then glanced toward the iron bars. "They say it's for my safety, that I'm lucky to be cared for, protected. But in truth, I'm not free to fly, not free to choose, not free to fade." The crow's wings fell slightly. "I never imagined," he said softly. "No one does," the peacock replied. "Because people only see what's shining. They don't look for the shadows behind it." He moved closer to the bars, voice low but steady. "They pluck my feathers sometimes," he said, "to make ornaments, costumes, gifts. They take pieces of me so they can carry beauty with them. But they never ask what I lose when they do." The crow was quiet. He felt the words settle into his chest like stones sinking into still water. "I wanted to be like you," the crow admitted. "I thought if I could look like you, I'd finally be enough." The peacock gave him a long, thoughtful look. "You already are," he said. "You just don't believe it yet." The wind stirred the feathers of both birds. For a moment, there was no noise, just stillness, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of truth, of grief, of something unspoken between two creatures who had finally seen each other. The crow nodded slowly, eyes lowered. And then, without another word, he flew away. Not with envy, not with longing, but with a question, one that would stay with him until the end of his journey. A moment of truth. The sky stretched wide above him, but for the first time, the crow wasn't looking outward. He wasn't searching for the next bird to envy or the next form to become. He simply flew, wings cutting through air, body light, but heart full. He had seen so much, heard so much, and now silence was all he wanted. He landed on a branch high above a quiet clearing, far from the crowds, the cages, the mirrored ponds and glittering feathers. The wind moved softly through the leaves. Below, the earth waited. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was running away. He felt like he was pausing, truly pausing, to listen to something deeper than the world around him. He thought of the swan, glowing with grace but aching for color. He remembered the parrot, bright and clever but trapped by attention. He couldn't forget the peacock, dazzling yet caged, his beauty celebrated, his freedom taken. Every bird he had met had carried a kind of sadness. Some wore it like a shadow, others hid it beneath applause. But it was there, and now, as the crow sat alone again, the truth he had tried to avoid finally arrived. The pain he felt had never been about being a crow. It had been about believing he shouldn't be. He had spent his life measuring himself by other birds' feathers. He had looked for worth in wings that weren't his. But now, in the stillness of the forest, something shifted. He didn't feel envy. He didn't feel shame. He felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from pretending too long. From wearing the weight of being not enough. And as he closed his eyes, a single thought rose up. Not loud, not dramatic, but honest. Maybe I was never supposed to be anyone else. The wind answered with silence. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't know what came next. He wasn't suddenly healed. But in that quiet moment, He touched something he hadn't before. Peace, not because the world had changed, but because he had stopped chasing it. Sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like a pause. The return. I'm ready to be me. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue across the sky as the crow glided gently over the treetops. He didn't fly with urgency now. He wasn't searching. He was returning, back to the tree where it all began. The same branch where he once sat in despair now welcomed him like an old friend. The forest hadn't changed, but he had. He perched quietly, letting the wind move through his feathers the way it always had. This time, he didn't resist it. He allowed himself to be still. Below him, the monk remained in meditation, just as before. But he opened his eyes before the crow even made a sound. "I've been waiting," the monk said, his voice soft, as if speaking to a familiar part of himself. The crow nodded slowly. He didn't need to be asked how the journey had gone. His eyes told the story. The longing, the envy, the chasing, he had carried all of it. And now he had put it down. "I don't want to be a swan," the crow said quietly, "or a parrot, or even a peacock." The monk's gaze stayed steady. "I met them all," the crow continued, "and each one carries their own kind of sadness, hidden beneath feathers, behind beauty, behind the things I once wanted." He paused, not because he was uncertain, but because the words now came with clarity, not desperation. "I used to believe that if I became someone else, I would finally be happy. But now I see. I wasn't suffering because I was a crow. I was suffering because I thought I shouldn't be." There was a stillness after he spoke, not empty, but full, like the space after a bell has rung, when its echo still lingers in the heart. The monk gave a gentle smile. "That," he said, "is wisdom." The crow looked up at the sky. It wasn't brighter than before. The world hadn't changed its opinion of him. People might still turn away. He might still be misunderstood. But something inside him had shifted, something permanent, something quiet. "I'm ready to be me," he said, not loudly, not boldly, but with peace. The monk nodded. "Then you are free," he replied. The crow closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he spread his wings, not to escape, not to transform, but simply to fly. And as he lifted off the branch and soared into the open sky, he carried nothing but himself. And for the first time, that was enough. What the forest teaches about comparison. The forest was quiet again, just as it had been in the beginning. But for the crow, nothing was the same. Every leaf, every branch, every gust of wind felt like part of a conversation he had finally learned to listen to. He sat on the same tree where his journey had started, not as the same bird, but as someone who had returned to himself. The monk, still beneath the tree, opened his eyes. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked up and smiled, as if he too had been listening, not just to the forest, but to the transformation unfolding quietly above him. "I didn't expect the swan to be sad," the crow said, "or the parrot to be afraid, or the peacock to feel trapped." The monk nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "Comparison," he said, "is a clever illusion. It promises happiness by pointing to someone else's life, but it never shows the full picture." The crow listened closely. There was no judgment in the monk's tone, only truth, spoken gently. "We compare the outside of others to the inside of ourselves," the monk continued. "We see their shine, but not their shadow, their applause, but not their ache. And the more we compare, the more we forget who we are." The crow lowered his eyes. He knew those words intimately now. He had lived them, flown through them. He had tried to borrow worth from feathers that weren't his, and it had only led him further from peace. "In the forest," the monk said, "no tree tries to be another. The oak does not envy the pine. The bamboo does not resent the fern. Each grows in its own rhythm. Each contributes to the whole, and none of them doubt their place in the world. The wind moved through the trees, as if to echo the message. But we, the monk added, forget. We measure ourselves against others, thinking it will make us better, but it only makes us bitter. The crow said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, settling quietly into the space between them. The monk closed his eyes again. When you stop comparing, he said, you start living. The crow looked out over the forest. The light was shifting now, golden and soft. He thought of all the time he had lost trying to be someone else. But there was no anger in him, no regret, only a stillness and a sense of returning, like coming home after being lost for far too long. Maybe that was the lesson. Not that others had it worse or better, but that peace begins the moment you stop measuring your life by someone else's path. And in that forest, surrounded by trees that never needed to compete, the crow finally felt free, not just from comparison, but from the belief that he ever had to become more than he already was. The sky was always yours. The crow stood at the edge of the highest branch, the wind brushing softly through his feathers. Below him stretched the forest that had once felt so cruel, full of things he wasn't, birds he could never be, voices he thought he lacked. But now, that same forest felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The monk was still there beneath the tree, silent and still as ever, not watching, not expecting, simply present. The crow looked up at the sky. It was vast and open, painted in fading gold and streaks of pale pink as the sun dipped behind the hills. It wasn't a new sky. It had always been there. But for the first time, he saw it not as something far away, reserved for better birds, but as something that belonged to him, too. He had spent so long thinking he was small, unwanted, unworthy. He had believed his wings weren't beautiful enough, his voice too rough, his place too low. But all along, the sky had never cared. It had waited patiently. It had never once told him he had to be someone else before he could fly. He stretched his wings, not to escape, not to impress, not to prove anything, just because it felt right, just because they were his. And then he flew, not higher than the swan, not brighter than the parrot, not more dazzling than the peacock, just as himself. The air moved around him like an old friend. Every flap of his wings felt like a memory remembered. Every gust of wind felt like a truth he'd known all along, but had been too afraid to believe. He wasn't meant to hide in shadows or chase someone else's reflection. He was meant to rise. He dipped and turned, not with elegance, but with joy. Not with grace, but with freedom. And the more he moved, the lighter he felt. Not because the world had changed its opinion of him, but because he had stopped needing it to. Far below, the monk looked up. He didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply watched, the way one watches a bird finally fly without chains. And somewhere, in that silent sky, the crow whispered, not out loud, but from within, the sky was always mine. He just needed to remember. Final insight. You were enough all along. Long after the crow had disappeared into the sky, the forest remained still. The monk beneath the tree did not move. He didn't need to. Some journeys don't require footsteps. They unfold in the heart. And this one had come full circle. The crow's search had taken him far, from the swan's quiet sadness, to the parrot's colorful fear, to the peacock's golden prison. But none of them gave him what he was looking for, because what he was truly searching for had never been outside him. It was never about feathers, voices, or admiration. It was about worth. And somewhere along the way, he had started to believe he didn't have any. That's the trap so many of us fall into. We compare, we perform, we try to earn love by becoming someone we're not. We chase after beauty, attention, success, thinking they'll finally make us feel complete. But what if you didn't need to be more to be enough? What if the peace you've been searching for has always been with you, waiting for you to stop running? The crow didn't become extraordinary by changing. He became free by returning, by remembering who he was before the world told him otherwise. And maybe that's your story, too. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you've just forgotten how to see yourself clearly. So if this story touched something in you, some old ache, some buried longing, let it be more than just a story. Let it be a turning point. Share it with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Subscribe if you want to keep walking this path of stories that heal, that hold space, that gently guide you home. And if you feel moved, leave a comment. Tell us what you saw in yourself today, because someone, somewhere, is still trying to become a swan. And your voice, your presence, might just remind them they were already enough. And so were you, all along.